There is a moment, and you may have already passed through it without realizing what it was, when you stop reaching for the phone. Not because you are angry, not because you have made some dramatic decision to cut someone off, but because something inside you simply does not move toward them the way it used to. The hand stays still. The chest does not tighten with the old urgency to check in, to smooth over, to make sure they are all right. And in that stillness, something extraordinary begins to happen, not to you, but around you. The people who have relied on your emotional availability for years, sometimes for decades, begin to behave as though something dangerous is occurring. They do not name it, they likely cannot, but they feel it the way animals feel a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm. Something has shifted in the field between you and them, and they do not know what to do with the sensation. You need to understand what is actually happening here, because if you do not, you will almost certainly interpret their reaction as evidence that you have done something wrong. That is the old pattern. That is the groove worn so deep into your nervous system that it functions like gravity, pulling you back towards responsibility for emotions that were never yours to manage. What is actually happening is far simpler and far more unsettling than wrongdoing. You have begun to withdraw a supply, not love, not care, not even attention. Exactly, you have begun to withdraw the particular kind of emotional oxygen that certain people in your life have been breathing without ever having to name it. Ask for it or reciprocate it. And now that the air is thinning, they are gasping, but they will not say they are gasping. They will say, "You have changed." They will say, "You seem distant." They will say, "You are not yourself." What they mean, though they will never frame it this way, is that the version of you that served their unconscious needs is no longer reliably available. And this is experienced not as your growth, but as their loss. This is not a small thing. This is the surface crack that reveals the entire architecture beneath it. And the architecture, if you are willing to look at it honestly, was not built by you alone. It was built in childhood. It was built before you had language for what was happening, before you had any framework for understanding why your emotional energy was being conscripted into the service of someone else's stability. You were not asked, you were not trained, you were simply absorbed into a system that needed a particular function filled, and you filled it not because you were weak, but because you were perceptive, because you could feel what others could not say, because your nervous system was tuned to frequencies that most people around you were deaf to. And in a family that could not regulate its own emotional climate, that perceptiveness became your role, not your gift, your role. There is a critical difference. The role looked like sensitivity. It looked like being the good child, the easy one, the one who never made trouble. It looked like knowing when your mother was about to collapse before she showed a single outward sign. It looked like adjusting your behavior, your tone, your very presence in a room to accommodate the emotional weather of people who were supposed to be accommodating yours. And because you were a child, you did not experience this as labor, you experienced it as love. You believed because you had to believe, because the alternative was unbearable, that your ability to feel what others felt and to respond before being asked was the very thing that made you worthy of being kept, of being fed, of being held, of not being left. This is the unconscious bargain, and it is the single most important psychological structure you will ever examine in yourself, because it is the foundation upon which almost every relational pattern you have repeated since childhood has been built. The bargain is simple, and it is devastating in its simplicity. I will carry what you cannot carry, and in exchange, you will not leave me. I will feel what you refuse to feel, and in exchange, I will be allowed to stay. I will abandon myself before you can abandon me, and in exchange, I will call this closeness, I will call this family, I will call this love. But it was not love, it was a contract, an unspoken, unsigned, deeply binding contract between a child who needed to survive and a parent or parents who needed a particular emotional function performed. And the cruelty of this arrangement is not that it was malicious. In most cases, it was not. The cruelty is that it was invisible. Your parents did not sit you down and say, "We need you to absorb our anxiety so we do not have to face it." Your mother did not announce, "I need you to manage my emotional state because I never learned to manage it myself." Your father did not declare, "I will be intermittently present and emotionally unavailable, and I need you to interpret this as normal so that I do not have to confront my own incapacity for intimacy." None of this was spoken. All of it was lived, and you lived it so thoroughly, so completely, that by the time you reached adulthood, the contract had become indistinguishable from your identity. You did not carry other people's emotions as a strategy. You carried them as a self. You believed at the level of bone, at the level of breath, that who you were was someone who feels for others, someone who shows up, someone who never lets anyone sit alone in their pain. And the world confirmed this belief at every turn. People told you how empathic you were, how caring, how rare, and each confirmation drove the nail deeper, because what was being praised was not your wholeness. What was being praised was your fragmentation. What was being praised was the very mechanism by which you had learned to disappear. Let us be specific about the mother complex, because it operates differently than most people assume. When Jung spoke of the mother complex, he was not speaking about your mother as a person. He was speaking about an internal image, a psychic structure that formed in the earliest years of life and that continues to operate long after your actual mother has aged, changed, or died. The mother complex is the lens through which you perceive all nurturing, all belonging, all emotional safety. And if your mother was someone who could not hold her own emotional weight, if she was depressed, anxious, narcissistically wounded, or simply overwhelmed in ways she could never name, then your mother complex is organized around a very particular conviction that closeness requires you to give more than you receive. That love is not a mutual exchange, but a one-directional flow in which you pour and pour and pour. And the pouring itself is what makes you lovable. You can see this complex operating in your adult life with ruthless precision if you know where to look. It is operating when you sit across from a friend who is telling you about their pain, and you feel a pull in your chest that is not compassion but obligation, a sensation that says you must fix this, you must hold this, you must not leave this table until this person feels better. It is operating when you cancel your own plans because someone else needs you, and you tell yourself it is because you want to help, when the deeper truth is that you are afraid of what will happen not to them, but to the bond. If you say no, it is operating in the specific quality of exhaustion you feel after certain phone calls, certain visits, certain holidays, an exhaustion that is not physical but existential, as if something essential in you has been siphoned off and handed to someone who did not even realize they were taking it. The father complex is a different wound, but it feeds the same system where the mother complex often organizes itself around emotional fusion, the loss of boundary between your feelings and someone else's. The father complex tends to organize itself around absence, around the experience of reaching for something solid and finding nothing there. If your father was emotionally absent, whether through workaholism, addiction, withdrawal, or simple incapacity, then your father complex carries a particular kind of hunger, nood hunger for love. Exactly, a hunger for structure, for authority, for the experience of being seen by someone who does not need anything from you in return. And because that experience was not available in childhood, the complex drives you to seek it in adulthood, in partners, in mentors, in institution, in ideologies, while simultaneously ensuring that you will never fully trust it when it appears. Because the original template says the one who is supposed to be solid will eventually disappear. The one who is supposed to hold the frame will eventually leave you holding it alone. This is why you end up in relationships where you are both the nurturer and the architect. You hold the emotions and you hold the structure. You manage the feelings and you manage the logistics. You are the warmth and you are the backbone. And you are so practiced at doing both that it never occurs to you that this is not partnership. It is performance, a performance so deeply internalized that it does not feel like performance at all. It feels like just who you are. And here is where projection enters. And it enters in a way that is far more insidious than most psychological discussions acknowledge. When Jung described projection, he was describing a mechanism by which contents of the unconscious are experienced as though they belong to someone or something outside the self. But in the specific dynamic, we are examining the dynamic of the empathic individual embedded in a system of emotional extraction. Projection operates in both directions simultaneously. You project onto certain people the capacity to eventually see you, to eventually reciprocate, to eventually become the solid, emotionally present figure that your complex is starving for. And they project onto you the function of emotional container, the person whose job it is to hold what they cannot face in themselves. These projections lock together like interlocking gears, and as long as both parties remain unconscious of the mechanism, The system runs smoothly, not happily, not healthily, but smoothly. The machine does what it was designed to do. The problem, and this is the problem you are beginning to encounter now, the reason these words even resonate is that you are becoming conscious, not in the dramatic, revelatory sense, not as an awakening or a breakthrough, but in the slow, grinding, deeply uncomfortable sense of beginning to see the machine while you are still inside it. You are starting to notice that the pull in your chest before a difficult conversation is not love. You are starting to notice that the exhaustion after a family gathering is not normal tiredness. You are starting to notice that the voice in your head that says, "But they need me," is not compassion. It is the echo of a contract you signed before you could read. And this noticing changes everything, not immediately, not cleanly, but structurally, because once you see a projection for what it is, you cannot fully unsee it. You can ignore it. You can override it. You can tell yourself you are being selfish or dramatic or ungrateful, but the seeing has occurred, and the seeing has consequences. The first consequence is that the emotional labor you have been performing your entire life begins to feel effortful in a way it never did before. Tasks that once felt natural, absorbing someone's anxiety, managing someone's mood, anticipating someone's needs before they arise, now feel heavy, not because you have lost your capacity for them, but because you are beginning to feel the weight that was always there, the weight you were carrying without knowing it had mass. This is the phase you are in right now, or near, the phase where the carrying becomes conscious, and consciousness in this context is not a relief, it is a burden of a different kind, because now you are holding not only the emotions of others, but also the awareness that you have been holding them, and the grief of realizing that much of what you called connection was actually a form of self-erasure so practiced, so polished, so thoroughly integrated into your identity that dismantling it feels less like liberation and more like a quiet, slow motion collapse of everything you believed about who you were. And the people around you, the ones who have benefited most from your unconscious labor, they feel this collapse too. Not as your grief, they feel it as their discomfort. They feel the subtle withdrawal of the emotional oxygen they have been breathing for years. And they begin to react. Some will reach for you more aggressively, increasing their demands, manufacturing crises that require your intervention, escalating their emotional displays in ways that are designed not consciously, but structurally to pull you back into the old role. Others will punish your withdrawal through silence, through passive aggression, through the particular kind of coldness that says, if you will not carry me, I will make you feel the weight of my absence instead. And still others will simply narrate your change in terms that reframe your growth as pathology. You are too sensitive. You are overthinking. You have been reading too much. You are not the person they knew. None of these responses are about you. Every single one of them is about the system, the relational system that depends on your emotional labor for its equilibrium. And when you begin to withdraw that labor, the system does what all systems do when a load-bearing element is removed it destabilizes, it protests, it tries to restore itself to its previous configuration, not because the previous configuration was good, but because it was known, and the known, even when it is painful, even when it is destructive, exerts a gravitational pull that should never be underestimated. You know this pull, you have felt it in the middle of the night when you wake with a sudden conviction that you should call someone, text someone, check on someone, not because anything has happened, but because the old contract is reasserting itself in the only language it knows, which is the language of anxiety. You have felt it in the moment after setting a boundary when your entire body floods with something that feels like guilt, but is actually the nervous system's alarm response to doing something it has been conditioned to treat as dangerous. You have felt it in the strange, hollowed out sensation that follows a holiday you did not manage, a crisis you did not absorb, a silence you did not rush to fill. This is where the repetition compulsion lives, not in grand dramatic reenactments, though those happen too. It lives in these small moments, in the almost imperceptible leaning forward, in the scanning of someone's face for signs of displeasure, in the automatic adjustment of your voice, your posture, your very energetic signature to match what the room seems to require. The compulsion is not to repeat the trauma. The compulsion is to repeat the solution you found for the trauma, the strategy that once, long ago, in a kitchen or a hallway, or a car that smelled like something you can still almost recall, kept you safe, kept you included, kept you from being the one who was left. There is a particular kind of tiredness that does not come from effort. You know it well, though you may never have found the right name for it. It arrives after conversations that, on the surface, were perfectly ordinary. A phone call with a sibling, a dinner with a partner, a brief exchange with a parent in which nothing was said that could be called hurtful, nothing was raised that could be called conflict. And yet when it ends, you feel as though something has been drawn from you, something deeper than energy, something closer to substance. You sit afterward, in your car or on the edge of your bed or in front of a window you are not really seeing through. And there is a heaviness that has no apparent source, no argument to point to, no insult to replay, just the weight of having performed a function so seamlessly that no one in the room, including you, until this very moment, recognized it as performance. This is the residue of the repetition compulsion operating at its most refined. When Freud first described the compulsion to repeat, he framed it in terms of trauma, returning the psyche's stubborn insistence on revisiting the wound. But what he did not fully articulate, and what Jung understood at a deeper structural level, is that the repetition is not always a return to the wound itself. More often, it is a return to the defense, to the adaptation, to the specific posture the child learned to adopt in order to survive the wound without being destroyed by it. And that posture, in your case, was absorption. You learned to take in what was not yours. You learn to process emotions that belong to other people. You learned to read a room with such precision that your response was already forming before the other person had finished speaking, sometimes before they had even begun. And this was not empathy in the way the word is casually used. This was a survival architecture, an intricate, finely tuned system designed to keep you safe by keeping others regulated. The compulsion, then, is not to suffer. The compulsion is to regulate, to reach for the old tool even when the old threat is no longer present, to walk into a room full of adults who are perfectly capable of managing their own emotional states, and to immediately, unconsciously, begin the scan. Who is uncomfortable? Who is angry? Who needs something? Who is about to unravel? And once the scan is complete, to begin the work, the invisible, unrequested, uncompensated work of adjusting yourself to stabilize the field. You soften your voice, you choose safer topics, you laugh at something that is not funny, because someone needs their joke to land. You hold a silence that someone else should be holding. You ask questions about their life because no one is going to ask about yours. And if you wait for that to happen, the silence will grow teeth. You need to hear something very clearly. The psychological reward for this behavior is real. It is not imagined. It is not a dysfunction parading as virtue. There is a genuine, felt sense of safety that comes from performing this function, and it has kept you psychologically alive in environments that might otherwise have destroyed something essential in you. When you were 6 or 8 or 11 and you sat in a room where the emotional current was volatile, where a parent's mood could shift without warning, where affection was unpredictable, where the difference between a good evening and a terrible one depended on variables you could not control, the ability to read and respond to that current was not a flaw. It was intelligence. It was your psyche's best available solution to an impossible problem. The problem was that you were a child in a system that required you to function as an emotional adult, and the solution was to develop a perceptual apparatus so sensitive, so finely calibrated, that you could detect shifts in the relational atmosphere before they became dangerous. But the solution outlived the problem. That is the nature of all psychological adaptations that form in childhood. They are created in crisis and they persist in peace because the nervous system that encoded them does not distinguish between then and now. It does not know that you are 43. It does not know that you have your own home, your own income, your own door you can close. It knows only the original equation. If I do not feel for them, something terrible will happen. If I stop monitoring, the floor will drop. If I take up space, if I have needs, if I stop pouring, I will be alone. And alone, in the vocabulary of the child, you were, did not mean solitude. It meant annihilation. So you repeated, not the wound, the strategy. You found partners who needed to be emotionally managed. You found friendships that operated on an unspoken agreement where your role was to listen, to hold, to absorb, and their role was to receive. You found workplaces where your capacity to sense interpersonal tension made you indispensable not because of your skills, but because of your willingness to metabolize conflict that others generated and refused to own. And each of these repetitions reinforced the original bargain: I am valuable because I carry, I am safe because I serve, I am loved because I disappear. Now, let us return to projection, because it has another layer that must be uncovered. When you enter a relationship, any relationship, romantic, familial, professional, while carrying the mother complex or the father complex in the way we have described, you do not simply bring your own unconscious material into the dynamic, you activate the unconscious material of the other person. This is what Jung meant when he described the way complexes interlock between people. Your complex does not exist in isolation. It seeks its complement. The child who learned to carry finds the adult who needs someone to carry for them. The one who learned to regulate finds the one who has never learned to regulate themselves. And the meeting between these two is not accidental. It is not bad luck. It is not a pattern you can break by simply choosing differently next time. It is a gravitational phenomenon. Your unconscious recognizes their unconscious with a speed and certainty that your conscious mind cannot override. Because the recognition happens before thought, it happens at the level of body, at the level of breath, at the level of the way a certain voice or a certain silence or a certain quality of emotional absence feels oddly, terribly familiar. Familiar in a way that the psyche interprets not as warning but as home. This is why you have stayed in dynamics that part of you knew were costing you something irreplaceable. Not because you were foolish, not because you lacked self-respect, but because the complex was fulfilling its function. It was recreating the conditions under which the original adaptation could continue to operate. It was giving you, again and again, the one thing you knew how to do: carry, absorb, regulate, disappear, because doing that thing was the only context in which you had ever felt like you existed. The terrible irony is that the very mechanism that erased you was also the mechanism that gave you a sense of self. Without the caring, you did not know who you were. Without the function, you did not know where you stood. And so the compulsion drove you back, not toward pain, but toward the only form of identity the complex had ever allowed you to construct. This is where the shadow enters, and it enters in a way that will be uncomfortable to look at directly. When we speak of shadow in this context, we are not speaking of your hidden darkness, your repressed anger, your secret cruelty. Those elements may exist, and they have their own importance, but the shadow that is most relevant to what is happening in you right now is something different. It is the shadow of your own authority, your own solidity, your own capacity to take up space without apology, to have needs without performing gratitude for their being met, to say no without constructing an elaborate justification that makes the no palatable to the person receiving it. These capacities, authority, solidity, boundaried presence, were pushed into shadow not because they are dark, but because they were dangerous. In the original environment, in the family system where your adaptation was formed, taking up space was threatening. Having needs was a liability. Saying no was a rupture that the system could not tolerate without making you pay for it. And so these healthy, necessary, fundamentally human capacities were exiled, not destroyed, exiled. They have been living in your shadow your entire adult life, waiting for you to reclaim them. And every time you came close, every time you felt a flash of anger that was purely your own, every time you wanted to walk away from a conversation that was draining you, every time you thought, I do not want to do this anymore, the old alarm would sound and you would push the impulse back down, because the original equation said that claiming these things would cost you everything. But now something is different, and the difference is not dramatic. It is not a revelation you can point to. It is more like a shift in the quality of light inside a room you have lived in your whole life. The furniture is the same. The walls are the same. But something in the way the light falls has changed, and suddenly you can see outlines you could not see before. You can see the shape of the bargain. You can see the mechanism of the carrying. You can see, with a clarity that is almost physical, the difference between what you feel and what you have been trained to feel on behalf of someone else. And this seeing, this quiet, unremarkable, devastatingly simple act of seeing is the thing that is changing the entire relational field around you. Not your decisions, not your boundaries. Though those may come, the seeing itself is the shift, because the system was never held in place by force. It was held in place by unconsciousness, and consciousness, once it enters, cannot be fully expelled. This is why the people around you are reacting the way they are. They are not reacting to anything you have done. In many cases, you have not done anything visible at all. You have not made announcements. You have not delivered ultimatums. You have not explained your inner process to anyone who would be capable of understanding it. What you have done is something far more subtle and far more threatening to the existing order. You have begun to occupy your own psychic space, and the space you are occupying now is space that was previously available to them, available for their projections, their unprocessed emotions, their unconscious demands. You were an open field, and they had been building on you for years. Now the field is developing a fence, not a wall, not a fortress, a fence, a simple demarcation that says, this is mine, that is yours. And this elementary distinction, this most basic act of psychological differentiation, is being experienced by the system as an act of aggression. You need to understand something about how projection operates in the other direction, how other people's shadows interact with your emerging consciousness. When someone has been unconsciously depositing their unprocessed emotional material into you for years, and you begin to return that material, not by confronting them, not by naming it, but simply by ceasing to absorb it, they are suddenly faced with something they have not had to face in a very long time. Their own anxiety, their own emptiness, their own inability to self-regulate. These are contents that were living in their shadow, being managed by you, without anyone acknowledging the arrangement, and when the arrangement shifts, those shadow contents do not simply disappear. They rise, they surface, and because the person experiencing this surfacing has no framework for understanding it, they do not say, I am feeling my own unprocessed anxiety for the first time in years because the person who was carrying it for me has stopped. They say, you have changed. You are cold. You are selfish. You are not the person I married or raised or relied on. This is the precise moment where most empathic people collapse back into the old pattern. Because the accusation lands on the exact wound the complex was designed to protect. You are selfish. You are cold. You are abandoning me. These words find the child inside you who signed the original contract. The child who agreed to carry in exchange for belonging. And they say to that child, see what happens when you stop. See what happens when you claim yourself. You lose them, and the child panics, and the panic feels like truth, and the truth feels like evidence that you were wrong to begin pulling back, wrong to begin feeling the edges of your own self, wrong to begin the long, slow, terrifying process of becoming a person who is not defined by what they carry for others. But it is not truth. It is the system's immune response. It is the relational organism fighting to maintain homeostasis. And what you are being asked to do, what you are, in fact, already doing, whether you recognize it or not, is to hold still in the face of that immune response and let it run its course. Not to fight it, not to explain yourself, not to manage their reaction to your individuation, because managing their reaction is the very pattern you are individuating out of. You are being asked to let them be uncomfortable, to let them feel what they feel, to let the system destabilize without rushing in to prop it up. And this, for someone whose entire psychological architecture was built on the imperative to stabilize, is the hardest thing you will ever do. What happens in the body during this time is worth understanding because it is not metaphorical. Your nervous system was wired in childhood to equate relational rupture with danger, not philosophical danger, physiological danger, the same circuits that would fire if you were being chased by something predatory fire when you sense that someone important to you is displeased. Your heart rate increases, your breathing shallows, your field of perception narrows, and you begin scanning for the threat, which in this case is not a threat to your body, but a threat to the bond. And the urge that arises, the almost irresistible urge to fix, to soothe, to bridge the gap, to undo whatever you did that caused the distance. This urge is not emotional weakness. It is a nervous system that learned correctly that in the original environment, distance from the caregiver was synonymous with danger. The problem is that the original environment no longer exists, but the wiring does, and the wiring does not update itself simply because you have read a book or recognized a pattern. It updates through experience, through the lived, embodied, deeply uncomfortable experience of tolerating the activation without acting on it, of letting the alarm ring and not running toward the fire. This is the work, not the insight. The insight is the beginning, and it is necessary, and it is real, But the work is what comes after the insight, the long, unglamorous, often excruciating process of sitting inside your own nervous system while it tells you that everything is wrong, that you are in danger, that you must go back, and choosing to stay anyway, not because you are strong, not because you have achieved some spiritual accomplishment, but because you have finally seen with enough clarity to act on it. That going back means going back to sleep, and you cannot sleep anymore. Something in you has woken, and it will not be put back down. The projection you were carrying for others, the one that said, "You are the one who holds, you are the one who feels, you are the one who makes everything bearable," that projection is beginning to dissolve. Not because you have rejected it, but because you have seen it. And the projection, once seen, begins to lose its binding power. It does not vanish overnight. It hints, it becomes translucent, and through it, you begin to see something you have not seen clearly in a very long time. Perhaps ever the outline of a self that is not defined by its function in someone else's psychic economy. A self that exists not because it serves, but because it is, and this self is not new. It has been there all along. Beneath the carrying, beneath the scanning, beneath the constant vigilant attention to everyone's interior weather, it has been there the way bedrock is there, beneath soil not visible, not dramatic, but foundational. And now, as the soil of the old identity begins to erode, the bedrock is beginning to show. This is not a comfortable process. Let that be absolutely clear. The erosion of a lifelong identity, even one that was built on self-betrayal, does not feel like freedom. It feels like loss. It feels like standing in a room where all the furniture has been removed and not knowing whether you are being emptied or being cleared. And in that not knowing, there is a tremendous temptation to fill the room again, to call someone, to offer yourself, to find a new crisis to manage, a new person to save, a new relational system to stabilize, because at least then the room would have furniture, at least then you would know your place. But the emptiness is not a void, the emptiness is a threshold, and what lies on the other side of it is something your complex has been protecting you from your entire life, not because it is dangerous, but because it is unknown, and to the psyche that was formed in an environment where the known, however painful, was the only guarantee of survival, the unknown is the most frightening territory there is, more frightening than the carrying, more frightening than the self-erasure, more frightening even than the loneliness that came wrapped inside the closeness. Because the carrying, the erasure, the loneliness disguised as love, those were familiar, those were mapped, those had rules you understood even though you could not articulate them. The unknown has no rules. The unknown asks you to stand without a script, and standing without a script for someone who has spent a lifetime anticipating, adjusting, and performing on cue is the closest thing to psychological freefall you have ever experienced. And you are in it now. You may not call it freefall. You may call it confusion, or numbness, or a strange flatness that has settled over your days like a film you cannot wipe away. You wake in the morning, and the familiar pull towards someone else's emotional life is still there, but it is quieter now, further away, like a radio playing in another room that you can hear, but no longer feel compelled to walk toward. And in the space where that pull used to live, in the space that was previously filled with vigilance, with anticipation, with the constant low-grade hum of monitoring other people's interiors, there is something you do not recognize. Not peace, not relief, something more unsettling than either an absence of purpose, a silence where the instructions used to be. You must understand what this silence is, because if you misinterpret it, you will retreat from the one thing that is actually saving you. The silence is not emptiness in the way you fear it is. It is not evidence that you have lost yourself, though it will feel exactly like that. What it is, structurally, psychologically, at the level of the deep architecture of your inner world, is the space that opens when a complex loses its grip, not when it dies. Complexes do not die. Jung was very clear about this. A complex that has organized your psyche for 40 years does not simply dissolve because you have recognized it. What it does is loosen. It releases its hold on the ego by a fraction. And in that fraction of space, something unfamiliar becomes possible. The unfamiliar thing is not a new identity. It is not a better version of you. It is contact with a layer of yourself that existed before the complex took shape, a layer that is older than the adaptation, older than the bargain, older than the role you were assigned in the family economy of emotion. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of the self, and it is critical that you understand this term not as a spiritual abstraction, but as a psychological reality. The self, in Jungian terms, is not the ego. It is not the personality you have constructed. It is the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, known and unknown. And it has its own center of gravity that is distinct from the center of gravity the ego has been orbiting for your entire conscious life. The ego's center of gravity, in your case, has been located outside of you. It has been located in the emotional needs of others, in the approval of others, in the stability of the relational field. Your ego has been orbiting other people the way a moon orbits a planet, defining its position always in relation to something external, something larger, something that it believed it could not survive without, and now that orbit is weakening, not because the planet has disappeared. The people are still there, the relationships are still there, the family is still there, but the gravitational equation has shifted because you are developing mass of your own, internal mass, psychological density. And this density is pulling your center of gravity inward, away from the external orbit, and towards something that has no name yet, something that you can only feel as a kind of weight settling into a place you did not know was empty. This is why life feels strange right now. This is why you find yourself standing in the kitchen at odd hours, not hungry, not restless, just standing. This is why conversations that used to energize you now feel like they are happening behind glass, audible but somehow remote, as though the frequency on which they are broadcast no longer matches the frequency on which you are receiving. This is why you have started noticing things you never noticed before: the quality of light in a particular hour, the way your own hands look when they are still, the sound of your breathing when no one needs anything from you. These are not signs of disconnection, these are signs that your perceptual apparatus, which was previously oriented almost entirely toward the external, toward the scanning, the monitoring, the reading of other people, is turning inward. It is beginning to perceive you, and you, being perceived by your own psyche for what may be the first time without the filter of function, without the lens of usefulness, are an unfamiliar landscape. Let us return to the father complex here, because its role in this phase is different from its role in the initial wounding, and the difference matters. In the early formation, the father complex created a template of absence, a psychic mold shaped around the experience of reaching for structure and finding air. But in this phase, the phase of loosening and reorientation, the father complex presents a different challenge. It presents the challenge of internal authority, because the father, in the Jungian sense, is not only the personal father, the father is the archetype of structure, of law, of the capacity to say this is and this is not. The father is the psychological function that draws lines, that creates order, that establishes the self as a bounded entity in the world. And if your personal father could not embody this function, if he was absent, passive, chaotic, or emotionally dissolved, then you have never had a living model for what internal authority feels like from the inside. You know what it looks like from the outside. You have watched others inhabit it with apparent ease: the colleague who says no without flinching, the friend who makes a decision and does not revisit it endlessly, the stranger whose posture communicates a kind of settled certainty that you have never felt in your own body. You have watched and you have wondered what it would be like to stand inside that kind of solidity, and you have concluded, at some unconscious level, that it is not available to you, that it belongs to other people, that your lot is the carrying, the flexibility, the yielding. But what is happening now, and this is what the silence and the strangeness are about, is that the archetypal father is constellating inside you, not as a figure, not as a voice, as a function, the function of boundedness, the function of no, the function of occupying a defined position in space and time, and not abandoning that position simply because someone else is uncomfortable with where you are standing. This function is emerging from the shadow where it has lived your entire adult life. And its emergence is awkward and unfamiliar and often frightening, because you have no template for it. You do not know how authority feels when it is not someone else's authority being wielded over you or around you. You do not know how solidity feels when it is not a wall you have built in desperation after a collapse, but a foundation that was there all along, waiting for the superstructure of the false self to be cleared away so it could finally bear weight. This is the mechanism by which power shifts, and I use the word power not in the social sense but in the psychological sense. The power that is shifting is the power to define reality. In the old configuration, reality was defined by the system. Reality was what the family said it was, what the partner needed it to be, what the relational field demanded in order to maintain its equilibrium. Your experience, your actual felt, lived experience of what was happening in any given interaction was subordinate to the system's narrative. If the system said this is love, then what you felt, which was depletion, was irrelevant or evidence of your own deficiency. If the system said we are close, then what you experienced, which was a suffocating lack of differentiation, was your problem to solve, not a feature of the dynamic. If the system said you are too sensitive, then the acuity of your perception, which was in fact the most accurate instrument in the room, was reframed as pathology. The power shift that is occurring is the transfer of reality defining authority from the system to you. And it does not happen through confrontation. It does not happen through conversation. It does not even happen through decision. It happens through a change in the internal locus of truth, somewhere inside you, in a place that is not yet fully accessible to language. The locus has moved. It has moved from out there, from the reactions of others, from the emotional temperature of the room, from the approval or disapproval of people whose validation once felt like oxygen to inhale, to the quiet, persistent, increasingly undeniable sense that you know what you know, that you feel what you feel, that what happened to you happened, regardless of whether anyone in the system is willing to acknowledge it. And this shift, this relocation of the center of epistemic gravity, is the most dangerous thing you have ever done to the existing relational order. More dangerous than leaving, more dangerous than fighting, more dangerous than any boundary you could ever set. Because boundaries can be negotiated, truth, once it has taken root inside you, cannot. The people in your life who operate from their own unexamined complexes will feel this shift as threat, and their response will follow a predictable sequence, though the specifics will vary. First, they will attempt to recalibrate the old dynamic by increasing the emotional demand, more calls, more crise, more subtle invitations to resume the carrying. This is not manipulation in the way that word is popularly used. It is the unconscious attempting to restore a homeostasis that it depends on. When this fails, when you do not respond with the old immediacy, when you let the phone ring, when you do not rush in to fill the silence, the second response will emerge. And it will be punitive, not always overtly. Sometimes it is the withdrawal of warmth, sometimes it is the sudden inclusion of other people in conversations that were previously private. A triangulation designed to make you feel replaceable. Sometimes it is the quiet revision of shared history, a rewriting of the narrative in which your years of carrying are minimized or erased, and your current withdrawal is framed as the original wound. You gave nothing, They will imply or outright state, and now you are giving even less. This revision will hurt. It will hurt not because it is true, but because it targets the exact place where truth and identity are most entangled. You know, at a level deeper than argument, that you gave everything, that you gave more than everything, that you gave parts of yourself that were not yours to give, parts that belonged to your own unlived life, your own unmet needs, your own unfollowed impulses and unexplored desires. You gave those parts away freely without being asked, because the complex told you that giving them was the price of belonging. And now, to hear that giving dismissed, rewritten, made invisible. This is a particular kind of grief that has no resolution in the external world. No conversation will fix it. No acknowledgement from the other person will heal it, because the wound is not the lack of acknowledgement. The wound is the years of self-abandonment that made the acknowledgement necessary in the first place. And here is where the deeper layer of shadow work presents itself, not the shadow of your aggression or your authority, though those remain, but the shadow of your own complicity. This is the hardest thing to face, and it is the thing that most psychological frameworks designed for empathic individuals deliberately avoid, because it feels too much like blame. But it is not blame, it is reckoning. The reckoning is this: you participated, not as a victim only, not as a passive recipient of someone else's dysfunction. You participated as an active, intelligent, psychologically sophisticated agent who found a way to survive an impossible situation and then continued to deploy that survival strategy long after the situation had changed. You chose not consciously, but at the level of the complex, to remain in dynamics that confirmed the original bargain. You chose partners who could not see you, because being seen by them was not the point. The point was to have someone to carry for. The point was to maintain the identity that the complex had constructed. The point was to keep the machine running, because if the machine stopped, you would have to confront the silence underneath it. And the silence underneath it was the one thing the entire apparatus was designed to prevent you from hearing. What was in the silence? What has always been in the silence? What you are hearing now, in fragments, in flashes, in those strange still moments in the kitchen, or the car, or the middle of the night, when everything drops away and you are, for just an instant, nothing but yourself without a function. What is in the silence is the original self, the self that existed before the bargain, the self that was not yet organized around service, not yet wired for absorption, not yet convinced that its value lay exclusively in its capacity to feel on behalf of others. This self is not a child, though it has childlike qualities: curiosity, directness, a startling clarity about what it wants and does not want. It is not an idealized figure. It is not the real you in the way that popular psychology uses that phrase, as though somewhere inside you there is a pristine, undamaged core self waiting to be liberated. What it is, more accurately, is a potential, a direction the psyche can move in once the complex is no longer driving, a way of being in the world that is organized not around the question, what do they need from me, but around the question, what is actually happening here? And where do I actually stand in relation to it? This potential terrifies you, not because it is threatening in itself, but because moving toward it means moving away from the only identity you have ever known. An identity, even a painful one, even one built on self-erasure and relational servitude, is not something the psyche surrenders willingly. Identity is the psyche's answer to the question of who am I, and when that answer begins to dissolve, when the carrying stops and the function falls away and the complex loosens its grip, the question reasserts itself with a rawness and an urgency that can feel like disintegration. You are not disintegrating, but something in you is the false self, the functional self, the self that was constructed to meet the demands of the original environment. That self is losing coherence, and its loss is not a failure. It is a prerequisite, because the new cannot form in space that is still occupied by the old. The internal authority that is trying to emerge cannot take root in soil that is still saturated with the patterns of self-abandonment. Something has to clear, something has to fall, and the falling feels like dying because at the level of identity, it is a version of you that has been alive for decades, the version that knew exactly how to enter a room and make everyone in it feel held. That version is becoming less viable, not less real, less necessary. And the difference between the two is the difference between grief and catastrophe. You are in the grief, you are in the strange, shapeless, impossible to explain grief of losing an identity you never consciously chose but inhabited so completely that it became indistinguishable from breath. And in this grief, you will be tempted to interpret every unfamiliar sensation as evidence that you are going in the wrong direction. The flatness will feel like depression. The withdrawal of emotional energy will feel like apathy. The sudden inability to perform the old functions with the old ease will feel like something is broken. But nothing is broken, something is being rebuilt, not replaced, not upgraded, rebuilt from the interior out, using materials that were always present but never permitted to bear the weight of your actual life. And the rebuilding does not announce itself, it does not arrive with clarity or confidence or the satisfying click of a puzzle piece falling into place. It arrives as a slow, almost imperceptible shift in the way you inhabit ordinary moments, moments that previously would have been consumed by the scanning, the monitoring, the relentless orientation towards someone else's emotional state. You notice it first in small things. You are sitting across from someone who is upset, and for the first time in your memory, you do not feel the old pull to cross the space between you and take their feeling into your own body. You feel something else instead. Something that has no name in the vocabulary the complex gave you, because the complex had no use for it. What you feel is a border, not a wall, not a barrier, not a defense constructed from resentment or exhaustion, a border, a place where you end and they begin, and on your side of that border, There is ground, solid ground, ground that does not shift when their voice tightens, does not tilt when their eyes fill, does not dissolve when the room fills with a particular emotional weather that used to send your nervous system into immediate compensatory action. You remain where you are, they remain where they are, and between you, for the first time, there is actual space, not the collapsed, enmeshed closeness that the complex called intimacy, but genuine relational space in which two separate people are occupying the same room without one of them disappearing into the other. This is not coldness. You need to understand this with every cell of your being, because the complex will try to frame it as coldness, and the people around you will almost certainly support that framing. What it is, precisely, is differentiation. It is the psychological achievement that was never permitted in the original environment. The development of a self that can be in relationship without being consumed by relationship. A self that can care without carrying, that can witness suffering without absorbing it, that can love without the love requiring the total evacuation of your own inner territory. And the reason it feels unfamiliar, even wrong, even frightening, is that you have never experienced it before. Every model of connection you have ever known has been organized around fusion, around the dissolving of boundaries, the merging of emotional fields, the unconscious agreement that closeness means the cessation of separateness, and now separateness is asserting itself not as isolation, not as withdrawal, as presence, your own presence in your own body, with your own weight. The weight is important. Let us stay with it for a moment, because it is the most accurate description of what integration feels like from the inside, and it is nothing like what the books describe. Integration is not lightness, it is not the lifting of a burden, though certain burdens do fall away. Integration is the experience of becoming heavy in the right way, weighted, grounded, anchored in something internal that does not shift with the emotional weather of the room. It is the feeling of having a center of gravity that is located inside your own body rather than inside someone else's reaction. And this weight, this groundedness, changes everything about the way you move through the world, though the changes are subtle enough that most people around you will not notice them for a long time. If they notice them at all, you walk into a room differently, not with more confidence, exactly with more mass. You speak differently, not louder, not more assertively, but with a quality of settledness that communicates below the level of language, that you are not available to be moved from your position by someone else's discomfort. You listen differently, where you once listened with your entire being angled toward the other person, absorbing their words and their feelings and their unspoken needs as though your survival depended on the accuracy of your reception. You now listen from a place that is rooted. You hear them, you take in what they are saying, but you do not leave yourself in order to do it. You remain on your own ground while extending your attention toward theirs. And this simple, revolutionary act of remaining present to another person without abandoning your own inner position is something you have never done before, not because you were incapable of it, because the complex would not allow it, because remaining on your own ground in the original environment was too dangerous. The only safe position was evacuation, leaving your own territory and occupying theirs, managing their interior so that the exterior would remain stable enough for you to survive. You are no longer surviving. That is what has changed. The psyche is no longer organized around survival, and the shift from survival to something else, you do not yet have a word for what that something else is, and you should not rush to find one changes the fundamental orientation of every system inside you. The perceptual system that was calibrated to detect threat in the relational field begins to recalibrate slowly, imperfectly, with frequent regressions that will convince you each time they occur that you have lost all progress and returned to the beginning. You have not. The regressions are part of the recalibration. The nervous system does not reorganize itself in a straight line. It spirals, it loops back, it re-encounters the old pattern at deeper and deeper levels. And each encounter feels as intense as the first because the body does not know that you have been here before. The body only knows what it feels right now. And right now, it feels the old alarm, the old pull, the old desperate urge to cross the border and resume the carrying. And each time, you are asked to do the same thing you did before, to hold still, to stay on your own ground, to let the alarm ring without answering it. And each time, the holding becomes fractionally easier, not because the alarm becomes quieter, because your ground becomes more solid. There will be relationships that do not survive this process. You already know which ones, though you may not yet be ready to admit it. They are the ones that exist solely on the basis of the old contract, the ones in which your function as emotional carrier is not merely a feature of the dynamic, but the entire foundation of it. When you withdraw the function, these relationships will not simply change, they will reveal that they were never relationships at all. They were arrangements, unconscious agreements in which two people's complexes interlocked so precisely that both parties mistook the interlocking for connection. And when the complexes disengage, when you stop providing the particular form of emotional labor that the other person's complex requires, what remains is not a relationship in need of repair. What remains is two people standing across from each other with nothing between them except the truth that what held them together was not love but mutual unconsciousness. And this truth, when it becomes undeniable, will bring a grief that is different from the grief of the loosening. It is a cleaner grief, a more precise grief, the grief of seeing clearly and without defense, that you gave years of your life to a dynamic that could not hold you because it was never designed to hold you. It was designed to use you, and you allowed yourself to be used, not because you were weak, but because being used was the only form of belonging. The complex knew how to recognize, let this grief come, do not manage it, do not metabolize it on behalf of someone else, do not turn it into a lesson or a narrative or a growth story that makes the pain meaningful. Let it be meaningless for a while. Let it sit in you without resolution, without silver lining, without the compulsive need to extract wisdom from every wound. The grief itself is the integration, the capacity to feel it, to feel your own pain as your own pain without immediately translating it into someone else's experience or someone else's need. This capacity is the thing you have been building toward without knowing it. This is what your own emotional life feels like when it is not being siphoned, redirected, or suppressed in service of the system. It is not comfortable, it is not serene, it is raw and unwieldy and enormous in ways you were never permitted to discover while the complex was running the show. But it is yours, entirely, irreducibly yours. And from this place, from this raw, weighted, grounded, imperfect place, something begins to happen that the complex could never have anticipated, because it falls entirely outside the complex's model of how relationships work. People begin to relate to you differently. Not all people, not immediately, but certain people, people whose own inner work has brought them to a similar place of differentiation, begin to meet you in a way that is unlike anything the old relational template could produce. They meet you without needing you to carry them. They see you without needing you to perform. They sit with you in silence, without the silence becoming an emergency that someone must fill. And in these moments, you catch a glimpse of what connection actually is when it is not organized around the management of someone else's unconscious. It is quieter than you imagined, less dramatic, less intense, but it is real in a way that the old intensity never was, because both people are present, both people are on their own ground, both people are choosing to be there, not because a complex is driving them toward each other, but because something genuine, something that has passed through the fire of differentiation and survived, is holding the space between them. You do not arrive at this place through a decision. You arrive through a long series of refusals. Refusals to pick up what is not yours. Refusals to cross the border into someone else's emotional territory. Refusals to answer the alarm when it rings in the middle of the night telling you that someone, somewhere, needs you to abandon yourself in order to keep them stable. Each refusal is small. Each one feels, in the moment, like a failure of love, and each one, accumulated over time, builds the structure of something you have never had before, a self that is not contingent, a self that does not require the validation of being needed in order to experience itself as real, a self that can sit in a quiet room, alone, with no one requiring anything, and feel not the old emptiness, but a fullness that has nothing to do with another person, and everything to do with the fact that you are, at last, occupying your own life. This is not the end of love. It is the beginning of a kind of love you have not yet experienced, a love that does not require you to bleed, a love that does not ask you to monitor, manage, absorb, or disappear. A love that begins with the recognition that you are a separate being, that your separateness is not a flaw to be overcome, but a prerequisite for any connection that deserves the name. And from within this separateness, you will reach toward others, not with the old desperate, grasping, complex-driven reaching that was disguised as generosity, but with something steadier, something that has roots, something that can extend without collapsing, that can give without emptying, that can hold without losing its own shape. Jung wrote that individuation is not a path toward perfection, but a path toward completeness. Completeness includes the wound, it includes the years of carrying, it includes the mother complex and the father complex and the shadow of your own authority and the long, painful apprenticeship to a false self that was the only self you were allowed to have. Completeness does not erase any of this, it holds it. The way you once held everyone else with attention, with precision, with the full force of your considerable perceptive capacity, you now hold yourself, not as a project, not as a passion, as a fact, the fact of your own existence, unmediated by function, unfiltered by the needs of others, undiminished by the long years spent pouring yourself into vessels that could never hold what you were giving because they were not built to receive. They were built to consume. You are no longer available for consumption, not because you have built a wall, because you have found a floor, a ground beneath your feet that is not someone else's approval, not someone else's need, not the fragile, conditional stability that comes from being indispensable to a system that would discard you the moment you stop performing your assigned function. The ground beneath you now is something else entirely. It is the accumulated weight of every moment you held still when the alarm told you to move. Every moment you stayed on your own side of the border, when every fiber of your conditioning was pulling you across. Every moment you let someone else feel their own feeling without rushing in to feel it for them. Every moment you chose, against every instinct the complex had trained into you, to remain. You are still here, not because you fought your way to freedom, not because you achieved enlightenment or transcendence or any of the elevated states that the spiritual marketplace sells to people who are tired of suffering. You are still here because you did something far more difficult than any of those things. You stopped carrying, you stopped scanning, you stopped abandoning yourself in rooms full of people who had come to depend on your self-abandonment as a permanent feature of the landscape. And in stopping, you did not become less, you became actual, dense with your own experience, heavy with your own unprocessed life, weighted with decades of feeling that you performed on behalf of others and are only now beginning to perform on behalf of yourself. There is nothing triumphant about this. There is nothing to celebrate in the conventional sense. What there is ground. What there is the quiet, undeniable, irreversible experience of standing inside your own life and knowing that you are not going to leave it again. Not for a parent's anxiety, not for a partner's fragility, not for the seductive pull of a dynamic that promises closeness but delivers only the familiar comfort of self-erasure. You are here, on your own ground, in your own weight, with your own unanswered questions and your own unfinished grief and your own vast, uncharted capacity for a kind of presence that does not require you to disappear. This is not the end. It is the first solid thing